Hello, I'm Dr. Jonathan Doney. I'm a lecturer in education policy at the Graduate School of Education, and I'm just going to present 3 fairly short videos to get you thinking about how to engage with policymakers. Now, my background is in the history of policy development, mostly in education, but most of what I cover is broader than that. So I'm going to guide you through, as I say, 3 videos, each about 10 or 15 minutes long. First of all, thinking about the policy process, then thinking about what we know about how academics engage with policymakers, and then the final video thinking about what it is that you can do. So these are designed to prepare for and supplement a Q&A session that's going to be run at some point. Really just to get your creative juices flowing, to get some background. And so I'm going to launch in without any further ado. So, video 1, who actually makes policy and what does the process of policy look like? Some photos here from the Houses of Parliament. This middle one is from the House of Commons, where the elected representatives of the people in the UK meet together. And the other 2, the one each side, the red benches, are the House of Lords, which is our upper chamber with a non-elected group of people who also subject legislation, laws to scrutiny. However, that's not the only way that policy works. So, who makes policy? I'm restricting policy here to sort of national directives. Policy is made usually at the instigation of government. Government and Parliament are not the same thing. Government is the group of politicians that have the majority in the House of Commons. So as we speak, in April 2021, the Conservative Party have the majority of seats in the House of Commons. They therefore form a government and they bring proposals to Parliament, which is the totality of the House of Commons, the elected group, and also the House of Lords, the unelected group. So policy legislation is brought by government to Parliament, it's discussed, and depending on how big the majority the government has, sometimes it will go through unproblematically. If the majority that they have is very small, sometimes things are more difficult. But they're not the only groups that are involved. First of all, the devolved bodies, the parliaments, the assemblies of Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland are involved in making policy. Local government, the local council, Devon County Council, for example, Exeter City Council, for example. There are multiple layers of governance in the UK. But there are others who are also involved, influencers. Talk a moment about who they are. Influencers influence policy development. As I'm preparing this video, we've had in the news the last few days a scandal over lobbying by previous prime ministers trying to influence how certain policies are developed. There are legitimate and there are illegitimate groups who influence. Implementers also influence. They influence how policy that has been set is actually implemented. One example here is the legislation around what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do in regards to COVID regulations. Different police forces around the country have implemented the same rules in different ways. So in some places you get stopped in your car if you're leaving your town, in other places you don't. In some places you get told to return home if you're sitting in a park, in other places you don't. So policy is not a straightforward somebody says and everyone else does. So in terms of education policy, there are all sorts of people who are involved in that. There's the government bodies like Ofsted, head teachers, senior leadership, but there are also people who represent think tanks, policy units, entrepreneurs, people who want their product to be able to be sold in the new policy environment. Charismatic people are often involved in the development of policy. young unelected SPADs, that's special advisors and other advisors, teachers, Secretary of State, consultancy groups. Children and young people are involved in making education policy, either formally or through how it is implemented. Sometimes academics get involved in policy formation. That's what we're going to focus on for the most of the rest of this session. The media are a large voice in policy development, both in critiquing policy but also influencing how government understand the population feel about different policies. And there are global actors, the EU, for example, the World Bank, the OECD, and so on. So there are a number of models of how policy is developed. There's a very simple model. I'm going to share with you two quite briefly. A very simple model which is devised by Birkeland, and this is how it's supposed to work. This is how it works in theory. There's a problem. There's a problem that people want a solution to. So somebody in charge somewhere says, suggest some solutions to this problem. Maybe 3 or 4 solutions are discussed in more detail. There's some degree of selection goes on. Well, this would work, that would work just as well, and it costs less. Let's do that. Then there is some enactment. That policy is put in. Things are changed to make that policy the way that people work. Then that's the implementation phase. People follow those rules or they adapt them or so on and so forth. And in theory, there is then an evaluation of that process. Does the thing we've done solve the problem we had? If it does, great. If it doesn't, what do we need to change? What's the adaptation to that solution? And so a lot of policy development is iterative. That is, you come up with a solution, you try it, it doesn't work as well as you wanted, you change a part of it, or you redevise it completely, you try that out, you see how well it works, so on and so on. So that's Birkeland's model. The reality is that models of policy development look much more like this. This is a diagram from the Institute of Government. There are different groups within this. It doesn't quite matter if you can't read all the detail, but the groups that are involved: interaction with ministers, the media, evidence. Evidence is actually quite a small part of this diagram. Evaluation and learning, policy design, Europe, and so on and so forth. The point is that policy development is very messy and is not as straightforward as the textbooks might suggest. Now, there is one model of policy development that in my work, my research work on policy development, does seem to have something to it. This is by John Kingdon, and he says that policies are developed at the point where these 3 things come together. So you've got a problem stream. What is the problem? But then you've got a policy stream which is related to what is our liability, how much do we actually need to be involved, how much can we just let things run, what are the resources we've got, what is the budget we've got. There are many problems that could be solved if enough money is thrown at it, but very often there isn't enough money. But the thing that Kingdon brings in, which I think is really quite important, is the political stream. Politicians work on the election cycle. Their key aim and objective is to be elected again next time, to keep their donors, their party donors, happy, to maintain good public opinion. So this is an aspect that is overlooked, I think, in the earlier model, but is actually quite important in understanding how policy is developed. Part of it, at least, is about keeping politicians in their roles and about keeping the people who pay for that, the party donors, individual donors, keeping them happy. So Kingdon says where these 3 come together, there is a window of opportunity. So sometimes we have a problem, we have a solution, but we don't have a political will, and so nothing changes. Other times there is a political will and there is a potential solution, but there is a searching for a problem on which that solution can be hung. So key point, as I say, is that policy development is not straightforward. It's messy, it's untidy, and so that makes it a little more complex for us to think about where can we get involved. For those of you who don't know, the legislation system in the UK has a strict structure in as much as green papers are published by the government in theory as consultations. Ideas are thrown out for people to respond to. So one way of keeping abreast of what's happening in policy is to keep abreast of the green papers that are related to your discipline. In theory, green papers are designed to gather information, to gather evidence, to gather ideas in preparation for a white paper. A white paper is then circulated, usually in consultation for a bill. A bill is an act of Parliament in its first stage. A bill goes through various consultation processes, through committees. It's discussed in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords. There's second readings, there's third readings, there's debates, there's amendments, and so on and so forth. So in theory, there is a very strict, set out process for ideas to become legal policy. Now, the work that I've done in the looking over the last 40 or 50 years of education policy development is that these processes have changed very significantly, particularly in the last 10 and 20 years. And actually the COVID crisis has seen an increase in what are called statutory instruments, which are laws that are not subject to this consultation process. So again, the key message here is there is a process in place, but it's messy and it isn't always followed as it should be. However, these three aspects remain important. What is the problem? What is the political stream? What is the policy stream? And so the thing to think about, the thing for you to think about in terms of your work, in terms of your engagement with policy development is there a problem which requires attention? How can you bring focus to that problem? Is it a problem that's self-evident that everyone can see as a problem, or is it actually a problem that you've identified no one else is yet aware of? So, what is the problem? How can the problem be articulated? Which politicians are relevant to that problem? I'll say more about this, particularly in the third video. What are the dominant narratives around that problem? Sometimes as academics we see something as problematic, but other groups don't see it as problematic at all. So what's the dominant narrative around what you're positioning as a problem? Then what could motivate politicians to turn ideas into policy? Remembering that one of their objectives is to be re-elected. So if you identify a significant problem in a healthcare sector that can be solved cheaply, efficiently, and increase people's life opportunities, many politicians will be interested in that. In terms of policy stream, who influences policy in your area of interest? Not just politicians, but which think tanks, which groups, which lobbyists, which recognised experts or public figures? A few years ago, Joanna Lumley, an actress who I remember from growing up on the TV in all sorts of different programmes, became a very vocal lobbyist for veteran rights for the Gurkhas, a group in the British Army. Sometimes the recognised experts or public figures are not the people we expect. But who are they for your area? Who are the special interest groups and think tanks? And then do you have links into the populations and communities that are affected by these issues? So have a think about that. Maybe put some stuff together, make a few notes, but be prepared to think about those specifics as we go through some of the other parts of this presentation.